Good afternoon and welcome to the Rise and Fall of Space Sanctuary in U.S. Policy. If you have questions for the speakers during this session, please enter them into the chat feature below. And now we are pleased to welcome our moderator, P.J. Blunt, Associate Professor of Air and Space Law at the University of Mississippi and a colleague at the University of Luxembourg.
So hi, welcome everybody. I'm really pleased to be here to moderate this panel. And today we have Robin Dickey here to speak to us. And Robin works for the Aerospace Corporation at their Center for Space Policy and Strategy. She has a bachelor's and a master's from Johns Hopkins University. And she has actually written a really interesting paper on the idea of space sanctuary and how it has functioned in US policy. And so without further ado, I want to turn it over to Robin for her presentation, which promises to be very interesting, I think.
Hi, PJ. Thank you so much. Really excited to be here to talk today. And if anyone's been looking at the program or the schedule, they might notice that I'm not the only Dickey in attendance here at the Ascend conference. That happens to be my dad, Mike Dickey, talking at the same time as me. And it's pretty funny to be here at the same virtual place at the same time, especially considering we took such different paths to get here. Naturally, his was much longer than my path, but we won't hold that against him. But without further ado, I'm really excited to present to you my research on space policy and its history in national security. And so to start off, I'm going to share with you a bit of a picture of how we talk about space sanctuary today. So you can see here a wide range of different statements, all kind of variations on the theme that space is no longer a sanctuary. That previously we had treated space as a sanctuary, viewed it as a sanctuary, assumed that was the case, and that something has changed in the last couple of years to make that no longer so. And these statements here are from a wide range of officials in defense and national security. A variation on the space is no longer a sanctuary statement has also been included in the Space Force capstone document, as well as the recent defense space strategy. So it's really a prevalent statement that goes on. But with my research, I looked back a little bit at history to see whether this was really the case, that US policy treated space as a sanctuary. And what I found was basically since 1976, this has not been the case. So here we have two examples of declassified documents that actually use the term space as a sanctuary and name it as a potential US policy and reject it outright because of the views on how space would be treated. And so here we have both in 1976 and 1993. The 76 one is the first time I actually found the term sanctuary in government documents. And so here we have these two examples. There are many more from my research of there being a much longer history of treating space as a contested domain than many people would realize. And so to get started with a little bit on my research methodology, I've looked at this through the lens of a basic dichotomy in US policy between sanctuary policy on the one hand and contested policy on the other. And so this is, of course, not a perfectly clear-cut dichotomy, but how I describe it is sanctuary policy aims to prevent conflict in space by delegitimizing the use of weapons into or from space. And this is through different activities like space arms control, norms development, creating definitions and legal documents geared to protect space assets. So the real idea behind sanctuary policy is that you can create a political, diplomatic environment that makes it illegitimate or inconsiderable to do conflict in space. On the other hand, we have contested space policy, which aims to treat space as a contested domain by preparing and planning for conflict as a legitimate possibility. And so activities that come with contested space include authorizing and developing anti-satellite systems, or ASATs, as well as developing the doctrines and the training documents that would go with a space conflict pursuit. It also means focusing more on technical means of protecting satellites than on the diplomatic and legal means. And again, you can see in different administrations, say in administrations that pursued a sanctuary policy, often also authorize some form of anti-satellite weapon, and vice versa, with contested space administrations having interest or some kind of pursuit of space arms control. So my emphasis here is really on what are the priorities? What is the #1 focus? Because you'll often see acknowledgement of trade-offs that have to be made throughout the historical documents that I've looked at. And one last note on methodology that I have for you is my different levels of actors in US space policy. So of course, the United States government is an extremely complicated, pluralistic organization with many different departments and agencies and actors with their own interests, motivations, pursuits, and even tools to pursue those interests. And so I've divided up my focus between senior level policymakers, such as the President, the National Security Council, that's National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft on the top right, as well as top DoD civilians and joint staff. So for example, the Secretary of Defense. The next level I have is service level leadership combined with operational level leadership. So the service leadership, much of that that I looked at was the Secretary of the Air Force, Chief of Staff of the Air Force, although Army and Navy leadership also at times weighed in on this debate. We also have operational level leadership, such as combatant commanders for US Space Command, as well as we have Air Force Space Command, General William Shelton represented in the photo there. And finally, although this wasn't one of my 2 main levels of analysis, I also did research into how Congress weighed in. And this was at times uneven. There were different times that they would go in different directions with different levels of intensity. But at different times, Congress did influence, or at the very least, make their voices known when it came to what they wanted space policy to be. And so here we come to the crux of my research and really the findings that I have put together. And so I decided to, as I was going through this history, divide it up into 4 different eras. Each era marked by a key event that occurred at the beginning of that era that really helped to shape largely the public discussion and would be referenced much in the historical documents. So in 1957, of course, we have the Soviet launch of Sputnik. In 1976, we had a series of tests conducted by the Soviet Union of their co-orbital anti-satellite system that was an acceleration and an increased level of capability from what they had shown previously. And then in 1991, we had both the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Gulf War, which ended up demonstrating a lot of different space capabilities in combat on the ground that earned itself the name of the First Space War. And finally, in 2007, we have the Chinese ASAT test in which they destroyed one of their own weather satellites. And this, of course, has had a huge impact on the public conversation, and it's referenced pretty often. But what we'll see here is we start with the sanctuary era in 1957, and at each of these events, there were decisions made by different administrations to enforce these views. And so in the sanctuary era, although Sputnik raised different questions both about prestige when it came to space and about security and whether the Soviet Union could threaten the US from space, Eisenhower and his successors decided to focus on sanctuary policy through arms control pursuits, creating the Outer Space Treaty under the Johnson administration, followed by the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty under the Nixon administration. And the focus on this was because Eisenhower and his successors saw strategic reconnaissance, so the satellites that were heavily responsible for watching what the Soviets were doing with their nuclear weapons, as so crucial to nuclear stability that the only way to ensure that they were protected was to make sure that everyone saw space as off limits for conflict. What was interesting that I found about this era was that the service level leadership actually did not put forward space as a sanctuary. They were pretty in favor of a contested space approach. Many of them, especially within the Air Force, saw space as the new potential high ground for conflict. And so they were much more interested in pursuing things like ASAT programs, which did get authorized starting in the Eisenhower administration. But in 1976, we really saw this big shift in the policy documents. And that was when the Soviets conducted their ASAT tests which led the National Security Council under Brent Scowcroft to conduct a reevaluation of US anti-satellite programs and policies. And they decided that they could no longer follow the sanctuary policy, and they instead needed to contest space, which eventually led to the use of the term space control, which means protecting freedom of action in space for US assets, as well as being able to deny that freedom of action to potential adversaries. And so this term became very popular under the Reagan administration, which made these kinds of debates much more public. And they focused a lot on the idea of preventing the Soviets from having a monopoly in ASAT weapons, that there was an asymmetric vulnerability that they wanted to remove. And so with this pursuit of greater operational capabilities, you saw the 1985 test of an anti-satellite weapon that destroyed a satellite conducted by the US. And so this was clearly kind of the heightened era of contested space that is pointed to under the Reagan administration. What was interesting is many people who point to the Reagan administration for contested space often say that that went away or went back to a sanctuary policy under the Clinton administration in the third era. And that's because the Soviet Union had collapsed, removing our greatest adversary when it came to space, as a lot of those programs were defunded or removed or became more cooperative with the US. However, I found that the Gulf War actually was the much more significant event for space policy, in that it was used as evidence by officials to show how reliant the US is on space. And therefore, regardless of how intent other countries might be on threatening us in space, they believed that you had to still have strong contested space and space control approaches in order to make sure that we couldn't have that vulnerability used against us. And so in this way, you saw documents from the Clinton administration that carried the exact same contested space language as the administrations before it. And you also saw that even though the Clinton administration pursued a pretty wide range of arms control activities, they excluded space with the exception of intercontinental ballistic missiles from these pursuits. And so finally, we get to the fourth era, starting in 2007. And there's been a lot of talk, as I showed in the beginning, about how different this era is from the past, and that there's new threats, new programs, new challenges in space. And although that might be true for activities in space, I really hope this demonstrates that the policy of treating space as a contested domain has been pretty continuous since 1976. And the last point I want to make on this slide is that there's a difference between policy formation and policy implementation. So just because this was the national policy for all of these decades, doesn't mean that it necessarily translated into programs or activities that fully expressed this contested space approach. And we can talk more later about why that might be. So I have a couple more slides just on some of the main trends that I noticed throughout the timeline. The first is the role of these key events, which I've already touched on a little, and that each of these was pointed to as something eye-opening, potentially revolutionary, game changer for US space policy. And we really saw that in 1976 when the NSC and the top level senior officials decided to reevaluate space policy and turn it over to contested space. And when I looked at these memos, the language that they really used focused on how there was asymmetry, and that the Soviets had capabilities that the US might not have to contest space, that the US was perhaps more reliant on space than the Soviet Union, which became more of a theme later on, and that because of these differences and these imbalances, that sanctuary as a policy was unviable and not going to be applicable to US space policy going forward. And so what's funny is in 1991 and 2007, these major events, the first space war, the Chinese ASAT test, we saw the exact same language being used, asymmetric vulnerability and sanctuary being overtaken by events and no longer viable. So what we see is that these events become new pieces of evidence in a pre-existing argument, in a pre-existing policy. And the one other trend I want to point to harkens back to when I said that it wasn't a perfect dichotomy between sanctuary and contested space. Throughout the whole space age, we saw administrations pursuing both space arms control and programs related to space control. And so what really flipped around 1976 was which one had the priority. And this did not track versus administrations or which party controlled the government. It was truly a change over time that I saw. And so here we have the Nixon administration is quoted on the left from Deputy Secretary of State Ken Rush. And this is acknowledging, as they were in several documents, that the Soviets had increasing capability to threaten US satellites, but making the decision that any anti-satellite activities the US did on their side, they did not want them to interfere or undermine or disrupt the space arms control pursuits they were doing, such as the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty or the Strategic Arms Limitation talks. And we see the flip side of that under the Clinton administration in the 90s. And this is, again, even though they had a reputation for being more towards the sanctuary side, when the Russians proposed to have these new space arms control talks, several officials made very public statements that they wanted to ensure that any arms control talks couldn't interfere with space control pursuits, which they saw as the priority. And so when contested space became the dominant policy, arms control really lost this priority to space control and has kind of taken a backseat ever since. And so in conclusion, I just have a quote kind of from the end of my paper, and it's the idea that concerns that we have today about whether or not our satellites are resilient, whether they are survivable, cannot be tied back to the policy of national security space as a sanctuary. And this is because that policy simply hasn't existed, hasn't been enforced for decades. And so if we're going to understand the root causes of challenges that we're facing today, we really have to take a hard look at how we got to this point and what our history is, so that we can really dig down to see what are the other factors that got us here. All right, that concludes my presentation.
Thanks so much. So first, let me encourage the audience to send in your questions via the chat, and we'll try to get those in. But while you're forming those, I have a couple of questions here. And I think the one that I want to start with is you mentioned this in both the paper and your presentation today, this idea of sanctuary. The first time you see the word sanctuary is in 1976, when in a document that's essentially saying that's not our policy anymore. And I find that very curious that the time in which the sanctuary policy exists, it's never called a sanctuary policy. And I'm curious if you have any insight to that. I mean, there's part of me that can just see somebody choosing that word because it like reflects hippie communes or something, and therefore we'll use this word and it'll make sanctuary bad. But I don't know. Do you have any insight to that?
So first of all, it's hard to prove that what I found as the first document with sanctuary is necessarily the actual first document. It's possible that it was discussed earlier. However, when I was surveying, every time I could find the words space and sanctuary in the same sentence, almost all of them had the word not in between them, that they were in the negative, that space is not, should not, is no longer a sanctuary. And there were a couple people, especially in the 90s, outside of government, who were writing in favor of space as a sanctuary and used that term as such. But from what I see is that proponents of these kinds of policies don't tend to use the word sanctuary. And they usually focus on the specific activities like arms control, peaceful uses of space. And so this umbrella term really has been used almost exclusively by people opposing it. And so perhaps a reason behind it could be that sanctuary is a pretty strong term. You know, it's not just peaceful, not just safe, not just protected, it is a sanctuary. And so in some cases, I think it might have been selected as a term by people opposing those policies because it's pretty dramatic. And so it's easier to argue that space is not a sanctuary because sanctuary is such a high bar than it is to say space arms control isn't something we should pursue. So I think there's probably, nuances within that, but it was certainly interesting to me that sanctuary was almost exclusively used by people who did not like sanctuary as a policy.
Well, So let's then turn, because you talked a lot about arms control there, and I think that one of the interesting things, and my perspective is obviously as an international lawyer that sort of deals in disarmament agreements and arms control agreements, and I think that there's something interesting about, and it's a point that you just made, this idea that that arms control agreements and international law in general, and those types of normative restraints on states don't seem to be in the toolbox of the contested space policy advocates. And obviously you do make the point in the paper that this is more of a spectrum, right? That you know, despite the fact that Reagan often gets pinned with this, a lot of the time Reagan was using it as a bargaining chip to get arms control agreements. But why? But I do think that you know, when we move into the Clinton era, which you note in the paper, that there was talk that the Clinton administration was interested in space arms control, and they distanced themselves from it. They're like, no, not us. And then we get Bush's very explicit policy that we're not going to sit down at the negotiating table. And so I'm curious about your thoughts on why this type of restraint isn't included in that toolbox, because it's still a perfectly valid tool for controlling space, yet it seems to be rejected entirely by the contested space advocates.
I think some of what it harkens back to is a lot of these questions on asymmetry, and this is not just in vulnerability, but in how different officials view people adhering to international law. I think in the US, there's, you know, a strong perception and belief of, if we are signed on to an agreement, that's something that, you know, is binding, and the perception that that might not be the case for other parties to the treaty. So I think one concern that I saw kind of spread throughout the years was that if the US signed on to arms control, that perhaps it would tie their hands without tying the hands of those who might violate that. And so that was one thing I saw, was just fear that we would be the only ones to follow the rules. I think another challenge that we saw with the use of space arms control is also the timeliness challenges, in that space is so fast changing, and we have never had shots fired in anger in space. So for a group of people like space arms control or space contested proponents who believe that there is a strong possibility that we might have to have some conflict in space, but don't have any, you know, concrete evidence onto what exactly that's going to look like, since it's never happened before, I think it's very hard to take a long-term binding speculative approach as they would in a treaty or in law, because there's no way to truly know how that's actually going to pan out in the future. So I think contested space is a lot about what can the US do to protect our satellites, both on the defensive side of finding more resilient architectures and different ways to reconstitute and protect the satellites, but also how are we going to have deterrence in space. And so I think that focus on the US is the only country that the US truly knows what we're going to do, and not even always that. So it's hard to commit to that long-term view, I think, in the eyes of contested space proponents because of that.
So I'm gonna turn to an audience question here, and I think the gist of this question is: did you see a differentiation in sort of how these two concepts were applied based on where in space, right? So is LEO treated different from GEO, which is then treated different from the moon or another celestial body? Or are these policies sort of holistic in that they apply to the entirety of space?
That is a really interesting question. One thing that I saw was that there was some difference in how much of a sanctuary people saw GEO as. So most of my focus was kind of geopolitical, strategic, because of capabilities for contesting space at the LEO level developed so early on, that it was clear that everyone involved in space programs deeply knew that it was totally possible technologically to contest space if anyone who had the space capabilities wanted to. But GEO, on the other hand, I think is largely not featured so much in the conversation, because it was much harder to attack especially using a lot of the earlier systems that were developed. So I think some of the assumptions that GEO might be safe were there, but on a technological standpoint, I think the strategic considerations were for all of space, and that we rely on space assets and we need to make sure that they are protected. And either from the sanctuary perspective of law and the Outer Space Treaty for peaceful uses of all of space versus the programs to protect satellites, it was much more strategic or universal on the strategic side, and a little more differentiated if you were thinking of sanctuary as a technical concept.
So I'm going to turn to another audience question, and this one here you may not have a good answer for. I can maybe speculate and fill in some gaps, but the first is do you know of other countries or organizations that have gone through a sort of a similar transition from sanctuary to contested?
So I haven't looked into internal policy documents in other countries as much. So I can say that there has certainly become more rhetoric, especially in partners and allies, that contested space may be a problem. And we've seen that in the last couple of years, or that there is a problem that we would need to contest in space. So I've seen that recently in recent years. But what was interesting was, through my research, I did get to look into the Soviet side of things a little more. And what was interesting there was they looked at space much more from the beginning as a potential threat to the Soviet Union, whereas the US saw it much more as an advantage. The Soviet Union had different writings about how American broadcast satellites that could send signals into Russia that they did not want broadcast out to their people as a potential threat to sovereignty. So although they got on board with a lot of these treaties, there was a lot of pushback on how we were going to define peaceful uses of outer space, because they didn't necessarily see things that we saw as peaceful uses as truly peaceful.
And I can actually add to that, that's something that you see in the early UN documents. Is there's this moment where it's sort of when we're first pushing that idea of peaceful purposes out there into the world, the US was kind of on a non-militarized meaning of that, and then we saw this wonderful moment where, hey, we can look into other countries. This is great, and so we backed off of that. At which point the Soviets kind of turned and they were like, no, non-militarized is what we want. And then they got remote sensing capabilities and they're like, no, that's not what we want. And so I do think there's an interesting sort of fluctuation within Soviet and Russia that kind of wavers back and forth as to what their needs are. So to turn to another audience question, and I'm going to kind of jump on this because I'd made a very similar note. The audience question is, do you think there's room for sanctuary policies in the future? And I want to add to this. So with your 2007 part of your timeline, you use the words contested, congested, and competitive. And it's interesting to me because that was about the time that I was starting in this field, and it felt like you couldn't get away from those three words. They were everywhere. But now I'm thinking about this, and there are three new words that I can't get away from, which is safe, secure, and sustainable. And so I'm curious as to the interplay between those words and what role sort of a sanctuary policy, maybe not called a sanctuary policy, but more in that vein of restraint, might have in the future.
Yeah, it's a challenging question and a really good one. I think there are some elements of contested space policy that are going to be here for good. I think in terms of recognizing that there are potential threats to satellites, and some, intentional or unintentional when it comes to space debris. So I think the cat is truly out of the bag when it comes to changing architectures and making sure that, we don't just have a single exquisite satellite that, if it gets hit by a piece of debris is toast and we lose a capability. So I think that element of contested space policy is here for good. But as I've mentioned, this is a spectrum and there is a toolbox of a wide range of activities. And I think it is perfectly possible to include different elements of that sanctuary policy, including arms control or other kinds of agreements, in the larger toolbox. And there will be, of course, questions of how you weight it and what things might contradict each other or conflict with each other. But I think with the basic problem of the physics of space being that any one country's activities in space can truly affect everyone else, whether they want to or not. You know, if two satellites collide with each other, that debris is indiscriminate. It can affect anyone. And so, you know, that would be the same problem with debris creating anti-satellite tests. And you saw in 2007, after China did their destructive test, the international outcry against it was extensive, and they haven't tried anything like that since. So I think there's possibility, especially when it comes to specific activities that harm everyone, even the person conducting it in space. I think there's a real opening for that, especially as we see this growing kind of community talking more about space sustainability and safety. And we see interest in that from the US already in finding different partnerships, agreements, and ways to make space more safe and sustainable.
So before I go to another audience question, I actually want to follow on that real quick. Do you think that the policy, so that Bush era policy of we're not going to sit down to the negotiating table on new rules, do you think that we've effectively backed away from that a little bit and are considering rules, you know, and maybe not full-bore treaties, but things like the long-term sustainability guidelines, or do you think that policy still very much is in effect? Because it's something that I think it's talked about every now and then is, are we going to sit down and negotiate?
It's hard to say because that is such a specific tool. And so although I can say contested space policy lasted across many different administrations, you know, something that specific as to say, you know, we're not going to sit down is something that I think varies a little more administration to administration. And there's also the difference between saying you're willing to conduct these kinds of agreements and actually having, you know, the progress made on them. I think that there is definitely a possibility of different kinds of agreements, guidelines, you know, below the threshold of a full binding treaty, like a new outer space treaty. I think especially when it comes to trying to proliferate best practices and share those amongst different partners and then potentially to the whole world, I see in general a lot of interest in that. It's not quite one that I, you know if I can put my finger on it for policy yet, because I think it's one that is, it's a little uncertain right now. There's a lot of different ways it could go from here.
So I'm gonna turn to another audience question, and I'm gonna again kind of jump onto that question to ask one of my questions. So the audience member has asked, if a sanctuary perspective did not drive US policy and the US has viewed space as contested for decades, why do we hear so often that US military satellites are vulnerable? And what I kind of wanna add to that is you mentioned this idea that sort of policy formation and policy implementation are very different things. And so my guess is that the answer to the audience member's question kind of is in this realm of formation to implementation. So the kind of follow-on question that I want to add to this is, are we now in a place where we're implementing that policy, and when did implementation really begin in your mind, if it has begun?
Certainly. So there's always been attempts to implement the policy. And if I could tell you exactly how all of that happened and how we came to have this perception of vulnerability today, despite the policy, then I'll write the book on it. I'll accept the Nobel Prize. It's one that's definitely probably one of the most complex, questions in US space policy. But what I've seen is there were several cases I could point to of challenges or obstacles. A big one, of course, is the Reagan administration, in which the Reagan administration policy documents, very clear on contested space, proposed a number of programs, but ended up coming head to head with Congress, which still leaned towards a sanctuary perspective on space. And so Congress took on a lot of activities upon itself, such as restricting funding for the testing of anti-satellite weapons and using other tools of Congress that really, although they can't change the policy of the Reagan administration, they were able to dramatically affect how that was implemented. So that's one example. Another example of a challenge is in the Clinton administration. In this case, both the administration and the Congress were very interested in space control and contested space policy. But there was very different considerations of how that should be done. So the administration was shifting more from kinetic, destructive ASAT weapons to, after seeing the debris caused by the 1985 test, they wanted to do more temporary, reversible, non-destructive means of space control, and showed a lot of interest in switching towards that. Whereas Congress didn't quite grasp on, or they weren't quite interested in that perspective, and they still really wanted to see more kinetic space control programs. And so in this case, it was two sides that agreed on the general policy, but did not agree on how to implement it, which then causes problems. There's also the further problem that even if you have a policy that says space is contested, if you've never actually had conflict in space, it's very hard to know whether our satellites actually are vulnerable or survivable. That's never truly been tested, although you can certainly hypothesize based on what you can see. And so when you haven't had that concrete example of how it plays out in real life, it's really hard to also have a path that you can draw through all of the programs, all of the developments that shows exactly how we got here today. And so there's a wide range of factors. There's also the factor of stability in space. So even if space may not be a sanctuary, there is also the idea that starting in the 50s, it was very tied into nuclear deterrence. And that goes back to strategic reconnaissance satellites, that they were so important for watching what the Soviets were doing with their nuclear weapons, that there was a concern or a possibility that an attack on a satellite could be perceived as the prelude to a nuclear attack, and therefore would be part of a cycle of escalation that meant whether or not space is a sanctuary, you really, want to try to have as strong deterrence in there as possible. So huge range of possibilities, and in any number of combination that we got to that point. And then to follow up on, or to move on to your kind of side of the question of where we think we're at today, correct? Is that with the policy?
Have we moved from policy formation into policy implementation?
Mm-hmm. I would say that the big changes are kind of twofold. First of all, there's a major change in how we are publicly talking about the policy. So an example of that is even the big threat assessments that you've seen published on space in the last couple of years. We've been conducting threat assessments on space since we first, went out into space. But this is the first time that we have these major public documents using open sources that can be used to add to the conversation. We also now have an independent military service for space, the Space Force, under the Department of the Air Force, with its own leadership that can very publicly advocate for space policy issues, discuss them, and raise different challenges that they think they are facing. And so that it is clearly a major change in how it is publicly being faced and how it is being organized. Now that we have a space capstone document for the Space Force, we have much more use of the term of space as a warfighting domain instead of just as a contested domain. And so there are clearly changes in how I would say the policy is being implemented that don't necessarily have to mean that the policy itself changed. And so that was kind of the difference that I was looking to elaborate on.
All right, so we've gotten a sort of a follow-up question here, and I'll ask it. It may kind of get to what you were just saying, so if you don't want to repeat yourself, say so. But this one says, the overarching policy of contested has also been accompanied by a string of ASAP programs. Doesn't that suggest that the policy has been implemented? And why are those programs not considered evidence of the contested policy?
So that's a great example of, like I said, that it has been at least partially implemented. There have been attempts to implement it, and there were ASAP programs before there was contested space policy. The first ASAP program started in the late 1950s under the Eisenhower administration, and we had deployed different nuclear-tipped anti-satellite missiles throughout the 1960s up through 1975, when they canceled the old program and started looking into new ones. And so there's very much a string of activities that you can see that carries on through. And yet you still see the perception that satellites are vulnerable, which makes sense because an anti-satellite weapon cannot protect the satellite technically. You know, it can protect satellites through deterrence, but you see that there's an expansion of what vulnerability and survivability means. It's not just who can take out someone else's satellites, it's who can protect their satellites and, more importantly, protect their capabilities in space. So I think that's when people talk about the challenges and what hasn't been implemented so far, that you can see that as being one of the more stronger emphases. But it has been attempted to be implemented. There have been programs that you could point to, but I think the clear challenge is, has it been implemented to the extent that the people drafting the policies wanted to see?
Okay, so now that we've gotten that one, I'm going to go back to another audience question that came in before that, and I apologize to the audience member, but what about commercial entities? As they continue to take on a larger role in space, do you see governments giving up or being forced to give up some of their monopoly on the use of force? And I also, I would wonder, to just kind of follow on with the idea of commercialization, do the commercial players have a stake in arguing for sanctuary or contested in order to protect their own investments?
That's a great question, and is definitely a trend that will have even greater effects on national security concerns in the future. Do I personally think that the monopoly of force would be broken by commercial entities in terms of them having weapons of some kind? I would say not. But if it comes to commercial entities needing to think more about how to protect their own satellites through stronger communications links, better cyber security, or even better physical protection, say from radiation, which you get naturally with the Van Allen belts, as well as if there was conflict, you could see more radiation being used in an extreme example. But so there's, I think there will be some increase in the dialogue on that side, that there might be practices that could be adopted by commercial entities just to make sure that their own assets in space are a little more secure. I think that in terms of what stake they would have in the argument, I think the bigger national security discussion on commercial space is also to what extent is the national security side of the US government going to be focused on protecting commercial satellites as well as their own national security satellites. We've seen in a lot of policy documents kind of a gradual increase in referencing protection of US commerce in space of these commercial satellites. Whereas at the beginning, you know, when there weren't many commercial satellites in space, it really was focusing on protecting those national security satellites. So the balance between them is something that I think will be discussed more in the future. I think probably in general for commercial satellites, you know, whichever decision has the least risk to the space environment is what I would guess personally that the commercial side would agree on. But whether you interpret the greater risk to be pursuing a sanctuary policy and then potentially having an adversary develop these capabilities that they feel good to use because it hasn't been fully accepted, or if having a contested space policy and feeling stronger on the US side of capabilities, but you know, there's a potential there could be actual conflict in space and the, you know, debris that would come from that. So there's definitely up to interpretation that I could see entities arguing for either side from the commercial perspective. And it really depends on how you interpret risk.
So I want to kind of come back to the idea of arms control. And one of the things that you reference in the paper is the idea of national technical means as one of sort of those restraints that was used. And whenever an arms control agreement included national technical means, there was a corresponding obligation not to interfere with national technical means. But those were obviously bilateral, right? Those were between the United States and the Soviet Union and then Russia. And as we know, those treaties are slowly going away. By my count, I think there are 2 treaties that still have national technical means. One of them is the Restart, which is slated to expire. But we also have another real restraint in the Partial Test Ban Treaty, which prevents nuclear explosions in space. And as you just mentioned, the early ASATs were nukes that were blown up in space because it creates an EMP. Do you think that we are in danger of seeing a further erosion back and losing something like the Partial Test Ban Treaty?
So when it comes to the national technical means agreements, I agree that we do have the challenge with potentially New START expiring at the beginning of next year. Actually, my colleague Mick Gleason here at Aerospace put out a really interesting paper specifically tracking protection of national technical means through treaties. That is a really interesting explanation of what's happened before and what could happen in the future if it expires. So when focusing on the Partial Test Ban Treaty, I think that one is less at a risk of eroding than protection of national technical means. And that's, in my mind, because that there was a clear example of why it's a good idea for everyone to refrain from detonating nuclear weapons in space. That's because the US conducted the Starfish Prime nuclear weapons tests in the early 1960s, and it took out a large proportion of all of the satellites that were in space at the time. Granted, that was not many satellites, but everything within the line of sight, because of the EMP, as you mentioned, can be heavily damaged or destroyed. And so that is one where, especially with more and more countries, it's not just the US who has reliance on space. You know, everyone's developing capabilities that commercially, from a security perspective, socially, have relevance. And so nuclear weapons truly are the most extreme case that you could use. And so I think that it's easier to agree on that one lasting. Even if, say, a treaty expired on that one, I would not see that one eroding as a norm just because of its intensity. So it would have to be from, say, a rogue state that didn't have space assets that they relied on. And I would see it as less of a threat from near-peer competitors.
I always like to think about whoever had to call up the Soviet Union after Starfish Prime and be like, "We're sorry, that was us. It was an accident." So we're running short on time. I'm going to ask this last audience question. I think that you can probably answer it pretty quickly. If you were to speculate, do you think that that commercial entities are going to have a bigger role in cleaning up space debris, or do you think it's going to be governments, or do you think it'll have to be a joint effort on all fronts?
Oof, that is a tough one. I would say the easier answer to that one is probably everyone, you know, a joint effort that, like I said, activities by one group in space can affect everyone in space. And so if you're not getting buy-in from a wide range of actors, then you're likely not going to get a satisfying solution to the challenges. I think that governments, militaries versus commercial entities have different strengths and weaknesses and interests. And so there might be different balances in what kind of pursuits these different entities look into for how they would want to approach treating space and regulating some of those safety issues. But I think it's most likely that there's going to have to be interest and at least some kind of involvement from everyone in order to get that comprehensive solution.
All right. Well, with that, do you want to kind of make some closing remarks, some final points based on your presentation and your research?
Sure. This research was really a thrill to conduct and really let me dive deep into a fascinating, complex history of how the US has viewed and treated space. And the main takeaway I got from it is that there are continuities and discontinuities that are hard to see when you're sitting in a moment. And that, especially when you're comparing what is talked about publicly versus what are people deciding, in the room where it happens, to quote from Hamilton. And so the differences that I saw were so strong when you looked at how we were perceiving things versus how we were actually talking about them today. And so I think it's very valuable to look at, since 1976, there's an actual documented consistency that I can trace. And so the way we're talking about it now might not actually trace with what happened before. And so I think recognizing that is a major first step towards looking to what can happen, what we're going to do in the future. And then the other big finding that we've discussed at length here is that there really is a difference between what you decide you're going to do, what you put on paper as the national policy, and then working that policy through all of the complex people, organizations, and processes of the US government to actually get the results you're looking for. And so it truly takes a breakdown of who are the different actors, what are they interested in, what are their capabilities, and how do they process different policies and information. And so it's not as simple as deciding whether or not space should be a contested domain or a sanctuary. I've now gone back and provided the answer of what I think we had decided in the past. Now the question is how are we going to actually move through what our decisions are? How are we going to do things that are either different or carrying forward what we've done in the past? So that's it from me.
So I told Robin in an email last night that I finished this paper, and I thought it was really great. I've actually added it to my syllabus in my space security law class, which I'm currently teaching. So the students will all be surprised to get an updated syllabus. But I think that one of the important things that this paper really shows is it does sort of challenge some of the assumptions that we make in the space security community about when changes in policy happen and when things have really changed. And I think that the continuity that Robin has exposed in this paper really shows it makes US space policy much more explainable to some extent at the end of the day, rather than these momentous changes that suddenly happen and oh no, everything's different. What's really been shown is this gradual shift that has moved over time. And I found the paper really, really fascinating. And so I commend all of you in the audience to go and download it from the Aerospace website and give it a read. It's a great read, and I think it's fascinating. The documents that Robin quotes from in this are really fantastic, and I can't wait to get the bibliography and go and hunt down some of these and read them myself. But with that said, I want to thank the audience for watching and sending in great questions. And Robin, thank you. This was a lot of fun, and so thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, PJ. I had a great time.
All right, and so with that, I think we're going to hand it back over to the AIA.